At 0630 on June 13, 1944, Lieutenant James McKinley sat inside his M4 Sherman tank at the edge of a Norman hedgerow, 7 miles inland from Omaha Beach, listening to static through his SCR 528 radio headset while German 88mm guns hammered American armor 400 yards ahead. 23 years old. 8 months of armored training. First real combat. The radio crackled with broken transmissions. Baker 2, taking fire. Grid 4. Silence. Can anybody? Northeast corner. More silence. McKinley pressed the transmit button. Baker 2, this is Baker lead. Say again your position. Nothing but static. He switched frequencies. Same result. The SCR 528 was supposed to connect every tank in the company. Theory and practice were different things. Outside the hull, the sound of diesel engines mixed with artillery concussion. Smoke from burning vehicles drifted across the bocage. McKinley could see 2 other Shermans from his platoon position behind adjacent hedgerows. They were 50 yards away. He could throw a rock and hit them. But he couldn't talk to them. Not clearly. Not reliably. The radios worked sometimes. Other times they were just expensive static generators. This was the reality of armored warfare in June 1944. Every American tank had a radio. The Germans had radios too. So did the British. But having radios and using them effectively were entirely different matters. McKinley learned this truth within his first hour of combat. Tank commanders could send messages. Sometimes those messages arrived intact. Often they didn't. Range was unpredictable. Clarity was inconsistent. And when multiple tanks transmitted simultaneously, the frequencies collapsed into unintelligible noise. 7 days earlier, McKinley had landed at Normandy with the 2nd Armored Division. His company consisted of 17 Sherman tanks organized into 4 platoons. Each tank carried a crew of 5 men: commander, gunner, loader, driver, assistant driver. The SCR 528 radio set occupied space in the turret beside the commander. It weighed 65 pounds. It consumed significant electrical power from the tank's batteries. And according to the technical manual, it could transmit voice communications up to 10 miles. The manual lied. Or rather, the manual described ideal conditions that never existed in combat. Open terrain, no interference, properly tuned equipment, trained operators. Reality delivered hedgerows that blocked signals, artillery that created electromagnetic interference, poorly maintained radios, and crews who learned radio procedure from a 3-day course before shipping overseas. The result was chaos. McKinley's training at Fort Benning had emphasized radio discipline. Keep transmissions short. Use proper call signs. Maintain frequency assignments. Acknowledge all messages. Standard protocol. But training exercises at Fort Benning featured flat terrain, no enemy fire, and maintenance crews who tuned the radios before each drill. Normandy featured neither flat terrain nor maintenance crews. Just hedgerows, Germans, and radios that worked when they felt like it. The problem wasn't uniquely American. British tank crews struggled with similar issues. Their wireless set number 19 was technically superior to American equipment in some ways. Better range. More reliable frequency stability. But British commanders faced identical challenges coordinating multiple vehicles during combat. German tank forces used similar radio systems. They experienced identical coordination problems. The technology existed. The doctrine existed. The training existed. What didn't exist was a way to make it all function reliably when people were shooting at you. Before the war, military theorists had recognized radio's potential. Heinz Guderian, the German panzer commander, wrote extensively about radio communication in the 1930s. He understood that tanks required instant coordination to achieve breakthrough operations. Radio made that coordination theoretically possible. Theoretically. Guderian's early panzer divisions used radios extensively during the invasion of France in 1940. They achieved remarkable success. Breakthrough at Sedan. Drive to the English Channel. Encirclement of Allied armies. But that success came with caveats that military historians often overlooked. Guderian's radio communications worked well during the initial breakthrough when German tanks moved through open terrain with minimal opposition. When fighting intensified around Dunkirk and in urban areas, radio coordination degraded significantly. Tank commanders reverted to visual signals and messenger runners. The technology had limits. Those limits appeared whenever conditions became complicated. By 1944, all major armies understood this reality. Radios were essential. Radios were also frustratingly unreliable. American planners had invested heavily in radio production. The SCR 528 represented the latest technology. It used vacuum tubes instead of older crystal oscillators. It featured multiple frequency channels instead of single fixed frequencies. It included a separate intercom system that let crew members communicate inside the tank without using the external radio. These were genuine improvements. But improvements didn't solve fundamental problems. Radio waves traveled in straight lines. Hedgerows blocked straight lines. Radio signals decreased in strength proportional to distance squared. Normandy's terrain fragmented tank formations over distances that exceeded reliable communication range. And radio procedure required trained discipline that broke down under the stress of being shot at. The result was predictable. Tank companies advanced into combat with radios that functioned at perhaps 60% effectiveness. Sometimes less. McKinley learned to compensate. When radio communication failed, he used alternatives. Hand signals between tanks positioned close together. Colored smoke grenades to mark positions. Visual observation of friendly vehicle movement. Sometimes he simply drove his Sherman to another tank's position, opened the hatch and shouted instructions. These methods worked. They were also slow, inflexible, and dangerous. Every time a tank commander opened his hatch to yell instructions, he exposed himself to enemy fire. The Germans understood this problem. They exploited it. Wehrmacht tactical doctrine emphasized disrupting American radio communications. German forces used their own radios to transmit false orders on American frequencies. They jammed frequencies with continuous noise. They monitored American radio traffic to identify unit positions and intentions. And they positioned snipers to target American tank commanders who exposed themselves to coordinate their units. The Americans had technological advantage in radio equipment. The Germans had tactical advantage in exploiting that equipment's limitations. On June 13, sitting in his Sherman at the edge of a hedgerow, McKinley faced this exact problem. His company was supposed to advance through 3 hedgerow lines and secure a crossroads 1,200 yards ahead. Simple mission on paper. Impossible to coordinate in practice. He couldn't see the other tanks in his platoon. He couldn't reliably communicate with them. He couldn't coordinate movement. And somewhere ahead, German anti-tank guns waited. The company commander, Captain Robert Walsh, transmitted orders from his tank position 200 yards behind the front line. All Baker units advance on my command. Maintain interval. Watch for anti-tank positions. McKinley received the transmission clearly. But when he acknowledged the order, Walsh didn't respond. The radio was working in one direction but not both. Standard problem. McKinley made a decision. He would advance when he saw other tanks moving. Visual coordination. Same method armies had used for 50 years before radios existed. The Sherman's engine roared. McKinley ordered his driver forward. The tank crashed through the hedgerow. And at that exact moment, 15 miles to the south, another American unit was conducting an experiment that would change everything. They didn't know it yet. Nobody did. At 0645 on June 13, 1944, Technical Sergeant Robert Davies adjusted the frequency dial on an experimental radio set installed in a Sherman tank parked in a field near Isigny-sur-Mer, preparing to test a modified communication protocol that the Signal Corps had dismissed as impractical 6 months earlier. 31 years old. Pre-war electrical engineer. Zero combat experience. Davies wasn't supposed to be in France. He was supposed to be at Fort Monmouth, New Jersey, working in a laboratory. But someone at Signal Corps headquarters had decided that radio problems in Normandy required solutions from people who understood radios. So Davies received orders to join the 3rd Armored Division with a toolbox, a trunk full of spare parts, and authorization to modify any radio equipment he encountered. His mission was simple: make tank radios work better. How he accomplished that mission was left entirely to his discretion. Davies had spent the previous week observing radio communications in combat conditions. He watched tank commanders struggle with static. He listened to garbled transmissions. He documented every failure point. Then he started experimenting. The SER 528 radio set was well designed for its intended purpose. The problem wasn't the hardware. The problem was how crews used the hardware. And the bigger problem was how multiple tanks used radios simultaneously without a coordination system. Radio frequencies were limited. Each tank company operated on assigned frequencies to prevent overlap with other units. But within a company, all tanks shared the same frequency. When one tank transmitted, every other tank received that transmission. This seemed efficient. It wasn't. When multiple tanks transmitted simultaneously, their signals collided and created interference. When tanks transmitted too frequently, the frequency became saturated with traffic. And when crews didn't follow proper radio procedure, messages became incomprehensible. Davies proposed a solution that violated standard doctrine. Instead of having all tanks in a company share one frequency, he suggested dividing tanks into smaller groups with separate frequencies. Platoon leaders would communicate with their individual tanks on one frequency. Company commanders would communicate with platoon leaders on a different frequency. This created a hierarchical communication structure instead of a flat network. The concept wasn't new. Navy ships had used similar systems for years. But Army doctrine insisted that tank companies needed single-frequency coordination. Davies didn't care about doctrine. He cared about whether radios worked. On June 13, he convinced the commander of Company B, 3rd Armored Division, to try his system. The company had 17 tanks. Davies divided them into 4 platoons. Each platoon received its own frequency for internal communication. Platoon leaders received an additional radio set tuned to a command frequency that connected them to the company commander. The modification required rewiring some radios and adding an extra SEER 508 set to certain tanks. Davies completed the work in 3 days. The test began at 0645. Company B advanced through hedgerow terrain toward German positions 2 miles ahead. Davies rode in the company commander's tank, monitoring radio traffic. Immediately the difference was apparent. Platoon leaders could communicate with their individual tanks without interference from other platoons. The command frequency remained clear for coordination between platoon leaders and the company commander. When one platoon encountered enemy fire, its leader could direct his tanks without clogging the entire company's radio network. By 0800, Company B had advanced farther and faster than any other unit in the division. Tank crews reported clear communications. Platoon leaders could coordinate tactical movements within their units. The company commander maintained overall situational awareness without drowning in unnecessary radio traffic. The hierarchical frequency system worked. But Davies understood that technology alone wouldn't solve the coordination problem. Procedures mattered too. Standard radio procedure emphasized brevity and clarity. Keep transmissions short. Use proper phonetic alphabet. Acknowledge all messages. Good rules. But Davies noticed that tank crews under fire often ignored these rules. Stress degraded discipline. Commanders reverted to conversational speech. Messages became long and rambling. The solution was simpler procedures that were easier to follow under stress. Davies developed a shorthand communication system. Instead of full sentences, tank commanders used standardized phrases. Contact front meant enemy spotted ahead. Moving left indicated lateral movement. Fire mission requested artillery support. Each phrase was short, simple, and hard to misunderstand. Tank crews could use these phrases instinctively without thinking about proper radio procedure. The mental load decreased. Communication speed increased. Error rates dropped. By mid-June, word of Davies' modifications spread through the 3rd Armored Division. Other companies requested the hierarchical frequency system. Signal Corps officers arrived to observe the results. Some were skeptical. The system violated established doctrine. But the data was undeniable. Companies using Davies' modifications advanced faster, suffered fewer casualties from coordination failures, and maintained better combat effectiveness than companies using standard radio procedures. The transformation wasn't just technical. It was cultural. Tank crews stopped viewing radios as unreliable equipment. They started trusting their communication systems. Platoon leaders developed new tactics that exploited reliable radio coordination. They could split their units to flank enemy positions while maintaining constant communication. They could call for fire support with precise target information. They could coordinate combined arms attacks with infantry and artillery because their radios actually worked. Lieutenant McKinley's company received the modified radio system on June 20th. Davies spent one afternoon rewiring the SEER 528 sets and briefing tank commanders on the new frequency assignments. McKinley was skeptical. He had learned to operate without reliable radios. Changing procedures seemed like unnecessary complication. Then his company conducted an attack on June 22nd. The difference was immediate and dramatic. McKinley could talk to every tank in his platoon without interference. When his lead tank spotted an enemy anti-tank gun, the crew transmitted contact front, 200 yards, and McKinley understood their exact position within 3 seconds. He ordered his other tanks to flank left while his own Sherman suppressed the enemy position with machine gun fire. The entire maneuver took 90 seconds. Before the modified radio system, the same maneuver would have required 5 minutes and multiple visual signals. Enemy gunners wouldn't have waited 5 minutes. The new communication capability created new tactical possibilities. American tank platoons began operating like coordinated teams instead of individual vehicles advancing in the same general direction. They developed suppression tactics where one tank fixed an enemy position while 2 others maneuvered for killing shots. They learned to call for artillery fire on specific targets using radio coordination instead of pre-planned fire missions. They practiced combined attacks with infantry, using radios to synchronize movements and suppress enemy positions at precise moments. German forces noticed the change. Wehrmacht after-action reports from July 1944 noted increased American coordination effectiveness. German commanders observed that American tanks were maneuvering with unusual precision and speed. Some German officers attributed this to better training. Others suspected improved tactics. Few understood that the advantage came from something as simple as reliable radio communication. The German military had radios. They had excellent radios. But they didn't have Davies' hierarchical frequency system or simplified communication procedures. By August, the Signal Corps officially adopted Davies' modifications as standard procedure for all armored units. The system was renamed Tactical Communication Protocol 7A. Nobody called it that. Tank crews called it the Davies system, or simply good radios. Technical manuals were updated. Training programs incorporated the new procedures. Every Sherman tank rolling off American production lines received modified radio installations based on Davies' design. The transformation was complete. American armored units had achieved reliable radio coordination. But the transformation went beyond just talking to other tanks. Once tank commanders trusted their radios, they started finding new ways to use them. They coordinated with artillery observers to deliver accurate fire support. They communicated with air liaison officers to direct close air support strikes. They shared intelligence about enemy positions with adjacent units. They called for medical evacuation using precise grid coordinates. The radio became more than a communication tool. It became the nervous system that connected all combat elements into a functioning organism. Lieutenant McKinley experienced this integration during the breakout from Normandy in late July. His company advanced rapidly through French countryside, covering 30 miles in 2 days. The advance would have been impossible without radios. Tank commanders coordinated movements across multiple roads. They shared information about enemy resistance points. They called for air strikes on German positions blocking their advance. And they maintained constant communication with infantry units moving alongside them. The entire operation functioned because radios worked. By September 1944, American armored divisions were advancing through France with a speed that shocked even their own commanders. The breakthrough wasn't just about better tanks or more fuel. It was about coordination. German forces couldn't match the tactical flexibility that reliable radio communication provided to American units. Wehrmacht tank companies still operated with older communication procedures. They lacked the hierarchical frequency systems. They couldn't coordinate complex maneuvers as quickly. They couldn't integrate with artillery and air support as seamlessly. The advantage was subtle. 2 tanks of similar capability, one with good communications and one without, might seem equally matched. But a company of tanks with coordinated communications was far more effective than a company without. The whole was greater than the sum of parts. And that advantage multiplied across divisions, corps, and entire armies. The Germans had started the war with superior tactical coordination. By late 1944, the Americans had surpassed them. Not because of better equipment. Because of better communication. The transformation was complete. American tankers no longer laughed at their radios. They relied on them. And that reliance changed how battles were fought. At 14:30 on September 12, 1944, Lieutenant McKinley coordinated a 4-tank assault on a German strongpoint near Wallendorf on the German border, using continuous radio communication to maneuver his platoon through a minefield while under fire from 3 concealed anti-tank guns, a tactical operation that would have been impossible 6 months earlier. His Sherman took the left flank. His other 3 tanks spread right in a coordinated arc. Every move was deliberate. Every position was communicated. Every tank knew where the others were without visual contact. Baker 3, contact right, 800 yards. The transmission came through clear. McKinley processed the information instantly. German anti-tank gun position identified. 800 yards from Baker 3's position meant approximately 600 yards from his own Sherman. He scanned the terrain through his periscope. Nothing visible. Dense tree line ahead. The anti-tank gun was hidden. But he didn't need to see it. His crew already knew where it was because Baker 3 had told them. Baker lead to all units. Baker 3 suppresses target. Baker 2 and 4, advance left 50 yards on my mark. McKinley paused 3 seconds. Mark. He watched through his periscope as 2 Shermans emerged from tree cover 200 yards to his right, advancing in coordinated movement. They moved together. Same speed. Same direction. No visual signals needed. They heard his orders and executed immediately. Baker 3 opened fire on the German position, suppressing enemy gunners without attempting a kill. The 75mm shells were too inaccurate at that range for precision hits. But accuracy didn't matter. Suppression mattered. Keep the German crews heads down while Baker 2 and 4 maneuvered. 30 seconds later, Baker 4 position secured. Target in sight. McKinley acknowledged. Baker 4 fire when ready. The 75mm gun boomed. Through the tree line, McKinley saw the explosion. Target destroyed. The first anti-tank gun was eliminated. Total time from initial contact to destruction, 90 seconds. Standard German doctrine would have required 5 minutes for similar coordination. American tanks were operating faster because they were communicating faster. But speed alone didn't explain the advantage. The real consequence of reliable radio communication was tactical flexibility. McKinley could split his platoon into separate elements without losing coordination. He could respond to changing situations instantly. When a second German anti-tank gun opened fire from an unexpected direction, he didn't need to regroup his tanks physically. He just adjusted their assignments via radio. Baker 2 knew contact your front. Suppressing fire. Baker 3 maneuver right. The platoon adapted. No confusion. No delay. Just immediate response to changing circumstances. This was the consequence that mattered most. Not talking to tanks, but thinking as one coordinated unit instead of 4 separate vehicles. The Germans didn't have this capability. Not at the platoon level. German tank companies operated with single-frequency radio systems that created coordination bottlenecks. German platoon leaders couldn't direct their tanks with the precision that American platoon leaders achieved. The result was slower decision-making and less flexible tactics. By late September, American armored divisions were exploiting this advantage systematically. They developed tactics specifically designed around radio coordination capabilities. The most dramatic example was the armored cavalry screen. Small units of tanks advancing rapidly across wide frontages, maintaining constant radio contact with headquarters, reporting enemy positions, calling for fire support, and bypassing resistance to maintain momentum. This tactic worked only because radios allowed dispersed units to function as a coordinated whole. Captain Walsh's company employed this tactic during the advance to the German border. He spread his 17 tanks across a 3-mile front, with each platoon advancing on separate roads. Conventional doctrine said this was dangerous. Dispersed forces could be defeated individually. But Walsh maintained continuous radio communication with all 4 platoon leaders. He knew their positions constantly. When one platoon encountered heavy resistance, he redirected the other 3 to flank the enemy position. German forces faced attacks from 3 directions simultaneously. They couldn't respond fast enough because they didn't know where American tanks were until they appeared. The consequence was operational. German defensive positions that should have delayed American advances for days instead fell within hours. Wehrmacht commanders grew frustrated with their inability to establish stable defensive lines. American tanks seemed to be everywhere at once. They appeared on flank roads that should have been impassable. They called in artillery fire with devastating accuracy. They coordinated with air support to destroy German strongpoints before ground forces even arrived. The Germans were fighting an enemy that saw the battlefield more clearly and responded more quickly than they could. Radio communication created a second, less obvious consequence: reduced American casualties. When tank platoons could coordinate their movements precisely, they exposed themselves to enemy fire for shorter periods. When commanders could call for artillery support instantly, they didn't need to assault fortified positions directly. When tanks could share information about mine locations and enemy positions, following units avoided the same hazards. The result was measurable. Armored divisions using the Davies radio system experienced approximately 20% fewer casualties per engagement than units still operating with older communication procedures. Lieutenant McKinley noticed this difference personally. His platoon survived engagements that should have destroyed them. On September 18, his tanks advanced into a German ambush, 3 anti-tank guns positioned in a triangle with overlapping fields of fire. Standard tactics would have required his platoon to assault directly, accepting casualties to eliminate the threat. Instead, McKinley used his radios. He pulled his tanks back immediately, called for artillery fire on the German positions, and waited 15 minutes while howitzers destroyed the ambush. His platoon suffered 0 casualties. The Germans had prepared a perfect tactical trap. But radios made the trap irrelevant. This advantage compounded over time. Tank crews that survived longer gained more experience. Experienced crews fought more effectively. Effective crews achieved objectives faster with fewer losses. The cycle reinforced itself. By October 1944, veteran American tank platoons were operating with a tactical sophistication that matched or exceeded German panzer units, despite German tanks having superior armor and firepower. The Americans compensated for inferior equipment with superior coordination. German commanders recognized this reality. Wehrmacht after-action reports from autumn 1944 repeatedly referenced American communication superiority. Some German officers requested upgraded radio equipment for their own units. But Germany's industrial capacity was collapsing under strategic bombing. Producing radios wasn't possible when factories were producing replacement tanks, ammunition, and fuel. The German military understood how they were losing the tactical coordination battle. They simply couldn't fix the problem. The consequence extended beyond individual battles. Strategic operations became possible that had been impractical earlier in the war. The American advance across France in September moved so rapidly that logistical systems couldn't keep pace. Armored divisions outran their supply lines because radio coordination allowed them to advance faster than planners had anticipated. This created temporary fuel shortages that halted operations in late September. But the speed itself demonstrated radio communications' impact. Armies could move faster when their units communicated better. By November, the U.S. Army was conducting combined arms operations with unprecedented complexity. A typical attack involved tanks, infantry, artillery, tank destroyers, engineers, and close air support, all coordinated through radio networks. Forward observers with artillery units used radios to direct fire on German positions. Air liaison officers used radios to vector fighter bombers to targets. Tank platoon leaders used radios to coordinate with infantry platoons advancing alongside them. Engineers used radios to report mine locations and bridge construction progress. Every element communicated continuously. This level of coordination was new in warfare. Previous armies had coordinated different combat arms, but not with such speed and precision. The consequence was devastating for German forces. They faced attacks from multiple directions simultaneously, with no time to respond. Artillery landed on their positions seconds before American tanks appeared. Air strikes destroyed German reinforcements before they reached battle areas. Infantry assaults synchronized with tank maneuvers to exploit weaknesses in German defenses. The Wehrmacht was fighting an enemy that functioned like a single, highly responsive organism instead of separate units advancing independently. Lieutenant McKinley participated in one such operation on November 8 during the Battle for Metz. His tank platoon was assigned to support an infantry battalion attacking a fortified village. The operation involved 40 Sherman tanks, 4 infantry companies, 2 artillery battalions, and 4 P-47 Thunderbolt fighter bombers. Every element was linked by radio. The attack began with artillery fire that lasted exactly 12 minutes. McKinley listened to the countdown on his radio. Artillery observers adjusted fire based on tank platoon reports about German positions. When artillery ceased, McKinley's tanks advanced immediately. Infantry followed 50 yards behind. German positions that survived the artillery barrage opened fire. McKinley's platoon identified 3 machine gun nests. He transmitted their locations to the air liaison officer. 6 minutes later, P-47s appeared and destroyed all 3 positions with bombs and rockets. McKinley's tanks reached the village edge without encountering significant resistance. The entire operation from artillery preparation to village capture took 47 minutes. German casualties were heavy. American casualties were minimal. The operation succeeded because every element coordinated through radios. This was the real consequence of reliable radio communication in armored warfare. Not just talking to other tanks, but integrating every combat element into a synchronized system that could respond faster and fight smarter than the enemy. The technology itself was simple. Just voice communication over radio frequencies. But the tactical impact was profound. It changed how battles were fought and who won them. And by December 1944, American armored forces were advancing through Germany using tactics that would have been impossible 1 year earlier. The Germans had better tanks. The Americans had better radios. The radios mattered more. On April 12, 1945, Lieutenant McKinley stood beside his Sherman tank in a field near Dessau, Germany, watching smoke rise from the Elbe River bridge that his company had just secured using radio coordination that would have seemed like science fiction to tank crews at the start of the war. The bridge was intact. German demolition teams had prepared charges but hadn't detonated them before American tanks arrived. Speed had made the difference. Radio coordination had created the speed. The war in Europe would end in less than 1 month. McKinley had survived 11 months of combat. His Sherman had been hit twice, once by German anti-tank fire that penetrated the hull but missed the crew, once by a mine that destroyed the track but left the tank otherwise functional. Both times, radio communication had enabled his crew's survival. After the anti-tank hit, he transmitted for medical evacuation and received it within 20 minutes. After the mine strike, he called for recovery vehicles that extracted his tank before German forces could destroy it. Without radios, both situations would have resulted in lost vehicles and possibly lost crew. But survival was personal legacy. The larger legacy was doctrinal. The American military's experience with radio coordination in World War II fundamentally changed how modern armies thought about communication. Before the war, radios were considered supplementary equipment, useful but not essential. After the war, radios were recognized as primary weapon systems, as important as guns or armor. Every military doctrine written after 1945 emphasized communication as a core combat capability. That emphasis traced directly to lessons learned by tank commanders like McKinley. Technical Sergeant Davies returned to the United States in August 1945. He received the Legion of Merit for his radio system modifications. The citation credited him with significantly improving combat effectiveness of armored units through innovative communication procedures. Davies never considered himself a combat soldier. He was an engineer who fixed problems. But his solutions saved lives and helped win battles. After the war, he worked for the Signal Corps at Fort Monmouth, developing radio equipment for the next generation of tanks. His hierarchical frequency system became standard doctrine in the U.S. Army. The Davies system influenced military communication development for decades. The Korean War proved its continued effectiveness. American tank platoons in Korea operated with the same basic radio procedures Davies had developed in Normandy. The Vietnam War saw further refinements: encrypted communications, secure frequency hopping, digital data transmission. But the fundamental concept remained unchanged: hierarchical frequency assignments that allowed platoon leaders to coordinate their units without interference, while higher commanders maintained coordination between platoons. Modern armies still use this system. The legacy extended beyond American forces. After World War II, NATO standardized communication procedures based on American wartime experience. British, French, Canadian, and later German military forces adopted similar hierarchical radio systems. Soviet forces developed their own versions, copying captured American equipment and observed American tactics. By the 1960s, reliable radio communication was universal among modern armored forces. The tank commanders who had struggled with unreliable radios in 1944 had become training instructors who taught younger officers that communication was just as important as firepower. Lieutenant McKinley left the Army in October 1945. He returned to Michigan, enrolled at the University of Michigan on the GI Bill, and studied engineering. In 1949 he graduated and joined Motorola, working on two-way radio development for police and fire departments. His wartime experience with tactical communication influenced his thinking about civilian radio systems. He advocated for standardized communication procedures and hierarchical frequency assignments in emergency services. Many fire departments in the 1950s adopted radio procedures that closely resembled tank platoon communications from World War II. McKinley rarely talked about the war. But when he did, he emphasized one point: technology alone never won battles. How people used technology determined outcomes. The SCR-528 radio set was good equipment in 1944. It was even better in 1945, not because the hardware changed, but because tank crews learned to use it effectively. Training mattered. Procedures mattered. Discipline mattered. These human factors transformed radios from frustrating equipment into essential combat tools. The Sherman tank itself became symbolic of this lesson. Military historians often criticize the Sherman for being inferior to German tanks. The criticism was partially true. German Panthers and Tigers had better armor and more powerful guns. But American Shermans had better radios and better radio procedures. In actual combat conditions, the communication advantage frequently proved more valuable than armor advantage. A Sherman that could coordinate with other Shermans, call for artillery support, and direct air strikes was more dangerous than a Tiger that operated in isolation. The whole was greater than the sum of parts. This legacy shaped post-war tank design. Every modern main battle tank incorporates sophisticated communication systems as primary components. Modern tanks carry encrypted radios, satellite communications, digital networking equipment, and crew intercom systems. Some modern tanks dedicate more internal space to communication equipment than to ammunition storage. This design priority traces directly to World War II lessons. Tank designers understood that communication capability was just as important as firepower and protection. The broader legacy was cultural. World War II taught military organizations that information sharing was combat power. Armies that communicated effectively could coordinate complex operations, respond to changing situations, and integrate different combat elements into synchronized attacks. Armies that communicated poorly were defeated by enemies that communicated better, regardless of other advantages. This lesson extended far beyond tank warfare. Infantry tactics, air operations, naval battles, logistics operations, all were transformed by recognition that communication was fundamental to military effectiveness. Technical Sergeant Davies died in 1992 at age 79. His obituary mentioned his wartime service but didn't detail his radio system modifications. Most people who knew Davies weren't aware he had changed how armies communicate. He had never sought recognition. He had identified problems and solved them. That was enough. But his solutions continued functioning long after his death. Every time a modern tank crew coordinates with other tanks using hierarchical radio frequencies, they're using procedures Davies developed in a field in Normandy in 1944. Lieutenant McKinley died in 2008 at age 87. He had lived long enough to see tank communication evolve from voice radios to digital networks. Modern tanks shared more information in seconds than entire divisions could communicate in hours during World War II. But the fundamental principle remained unchanged. Tanks that talked to each other fought more effectively than tanks that didn't. McKinley understood this truth in 1944. Modern tank commanders understand it now. The technology has changed. The lesson has not. The radios themselves are long obsolete. SCR-528 sets sit in museums now, silent relics of a war that ended 80 years ago. But what those radios represented, the ability to coordinate dispersed forces through instant communication, remains essential to modern warfare. The Germans laughed at American radios in 1943. They stopped laughing when Sherman tanks started talking in 1944. And they lost because their own tanks couldn't talk back with equal effectiveness. The legacy lives in every military communication system developed since 1945. In every tactical radio that coordinates infantry squads. In every satellite link that connects ground forces to air support. In every digital network that shares battlefield information in real time. The technological sophistication has increased beyond recognition. But the underlying principle hasn't changed. Armies that communicate better fight better. Technology enables communication. But people make communication effective. That was true in 1944. It remains true now. And the lesson came from tank commanders who learned, sometimes painfully, that talking to each other was just as important as shooting at the enemy. The war ended. The radios were silenced. But the echo of those transmissions, the voices of tank commanders coordinating attacks, calling for fire support, warning each other of danger, that echo continues. Every time a modern military unit communicates, it uses methods developed by people who learned hard lessons in Normandy, France, and Germany. They were just trying to make their radios work. They ended up changing how modern wars are fought. That is their legacy. That is what remains.